Hello and welcome to Descender Dev. My name is Luke, also known as Giannery, and welcome to another user interface video in which I am going to demonstrate NC Star and the progress that has been made in the last month. Obviously, in the last video, I did mention about potentially trying to get a video out every 2 weeks. Looks like that hasn't happened, but I hope to improve this lot by at least working a bit harder on this. Obviously, as you can imagine, considering the fact that a lot of the boilerplate needs to be put in place in order to implement all of what you see here, it's taken a bit longer than usual, as you can imagine. So let's take a look here. What we have is fairly simple and fairly basic. There's not much really going on here. So we've got a button here, so when you click on it in the console, in the background you can see button clicked. If I check this, this is, it tells us the checkbox state is true, and then when we click it again, it's checkbox state false. And here we've got, so I can just click on it and it'll actually tell me, oh, it's changed to this, because obviously we're listening on a check event, if you like. It's not check event listening, if that's what you're thinking. There is no such thing as that. We're doing it slightly differently, and I'll show you that in a moment. But you can click on this and it will change, right? And this is a text box. Hello there. How are you? As you can see, we are indeed typing, and this is actually not too bad. So obviously we can highlight, we can, navigate using control, left, right, etc. Right, and holding shift highlights as well. So we've got quite a bit done, as you can imagine. Believe it or not, the text input stuff didn't actually take that long to do, because we're taking advantage of the text edit package in Odin. How did we get to this point? Well, if you remember in the last video, I started talking about compositions, components, component definitions, shapes, that sort of thing. Well, this is what we've got. Let's start from the beginning then, shall we? So, let's go into here. There is a lot of code here, as you can imagine, and there's probably going to be even more later. So if we go right to the very top, so I talk about this. None of this has actually changed. So what I've got here is an NC Star is a library for building complete custom user interfaces and applications using the Raylib library for the backend. In NC Star, there are two layers to building an object to render. Compositions, these comprise of shapes and their positions within the composition. The composition, which is bound by a rectangle defined by the user, draws the shapes on screen. And you've got components. These define one or more compositions with additional parameters. It can take unlimited compositions, and the parameters defined in component context can be used to determine shape or style behaviors, which is what you saw just now. Finally, components are constructed and pushed onto the global UI stack. It is within this stack that NC Star will perform event handling, modify parameters, and change UI states automatically based on user input. Well, I say automatically, it's not quite completely automatic. We still have to do some things in order to modify a variety of different parameters. So if we go down, I've already explained some of this in the previous video, so if you want to talk, if you want a little bit more information, you can go back onto the previous video where I discussed this in a bit more detail. So we've got shapes here. As you can see, I've added quite a lot since the last video. So we've got shapes. We've got a default shape procedure, so we can use that to basically create a shape that with default parameters or fields. If we go down here, we've got compositions. So we've also got a default composition procedure here as well. So we can do the same with that. And we've got composition related procedures here. So we've got calculate composition. So I think I had this in the last video. I can't remember if I did or not. Basically, we are calculating the size of the composition depending on a series of parameters. If we've got contents that we need to measure, then we measure the content, and we grow the size of the subject item if we need to. As you can see, we've got grow bounds to content. So if that's true and we require content, then we're going to do a few things. We're going to include some padding, and we're going to basically grow the size of the bounds, if you like, to the final width and height, which would become the content plus the padding. And then we determine what the rectangular or what the rectangles in the composition is, depending on the shapes. So we've got a series of shapes that we have within the composition, and those shapes can be located depending on the parameters that we give it. So shapes can either be aligned or not aligned. They can be aligned to the container. They can also be aligned to other shapes. This shrink stuff I haven't tested yet, so I'm not going to bother trying to explain that right now. But I mean, so the basic idea behind this shrinking is so that you can have one shape that is designed to shrink against other shapes that have already been aligned within the container. So the idea would be, for example, I'm currently working on a combo box. So you would have, say, a drop down button, if you like, on the right hand side of the component, and on the left hand side, which takes up the rest of the component, is the actual text that you see, right? But because we don't technically align that text, we need to work out how much space is remaining. So this is what this shrinking is designed for. So there's the difference between growing and shrinking. Okay. Obviously you can't have both at the same time. So if you have content that you want to use to grow the component, then the content and therefore make something shrink, right? Or it can't be part of a shrink operation. It can only be something that allows the overall component to grow. Whereas if you've got a shape that does shrink, it can't be used then to allow the content to grow. All of this will be explained much better later on when I start doing tutorials, and I've also got this thing called ncstar.io, which is the website. It's currently a work in progress. You can also go on there right now and see the documentation for it, although obviously this library isn't finished yet and isn't released. So we've got, alignments. We're doing some calculations here, and then we're also doing aligning shapes to other shapes as well. So that's that. And then also we've got dual composition. So once we've worked out all of the rectangular bounds of each shape within the composition, we can then begin to actually draw the composition. And we are determining whether or not the shape is visible. If it's not visible, then just continue. If it's also a text input wrapper and we're drawing text, then also continue, because there's going to be a different way we're going to draw text input. So we go through here. Now there's a thing called style bindings, which I will explain a bit better a bit later, but what we've got here is, let's say, bindings. So I'm grabbing all of these different styles from all of these different things, right? And we're determining whether or not we've got a binding. We're checking to see if the style definitely does exist, and we're either taking the idle state style or we're taking the style that we're supposed to actually use if we're hovering or we're down on the mouse or something like that, right? And then down here, finally, we actually do draw something. By the way, this is a check to see if we have any style at all. If we don't have a style, then we can't draw anything. So we're just going to say continue. So if, for example, you decide you're creating your own custom component within this library and you're wondering why it's not appearing, this is the reason why. You haven't specified a style for it. So you kind of need to specify at least the idle style. We'll get onto that in a moment. So as you can see, we're drawing pretty much everything apart from images. We haven't got that far yet, or rather I haven't got that far yet. That is in the pipeline. It's just not something I'm looking at the moment. I'm mostly looking at building some basic components to begin with, and then actually start building the actual editor itself, which is when we're actually going to look at building and programming, probably in videos. Okay, get into the component side of things then. So we've got a component definition and then component. So this is where things actually start getting done, let's say. So component definition. So there's two concepts. I think I mentioned this in the previous video. So we've got a component definition which takes a series of compositions, and those compositions, which contains all of the relevant shapes, has the definition for how something should be drawn. Okay. Got a few other things here like default index, for example. What is the default composition that we should render when we first create a component from this component definition? When we do create a component from this component definition, we are going to use this structure here, which is going to have a variety of different things. So we've got this thing called multi-interaction. That's how this inline radio works. So if I run this again, here we don't have any more than one interaction within this component. It's just one interaction. Click. This is one interaction. You click it, and it changes the state. Here, there's multiple interactions. So as you can see, when I'm hovering over these shapes, it's actually changing the interaction with that specific shape and leaving the other shape in its default idle style. When I click down on it and then up again, it will change. Okay, as you can see there. So I can click out of that. So this is what this is designed to do. We've got multi-interaction, which we define somewhere else. We don't define it here. And then we've also got shapes interacted, which again, this basically allows us to determine the visual and behavior states. So the visual state is whether or not the shape is down or is idle or disabled, whatever it might be. And then we've got behavior state determining whether or not it's been clicked or a value has been changed or something like that, right? And then we've got a few other things here. So we've also got this text input state. Any component can have a text input state, as you can tell. However, it needs to be set up correctly for that to work. We'll have a look at that. We have a few parameters or procedures here to specify what we want. So we can get the state of a component, for example, whether or not it's been clicked. We can set the fonts, update the content, and that's about it. There's not much here, But as you can see, what I'm trying to achieve with this is fairly simple. I want to try and keep things as simple as possible, but at the same time, as generic as possible. We are kind of going a bit kind of low level, I suppose you could say, in this UI library. I don't want it to be a high level library like a lot of retained mode user interfaces. I mean, technically this is retained mode. As you can quite clearly tell, it is very much retained mode. When it comes to rendering the stuff, it feels immediate mode, but we're retaining a lot of data. We've got some text input related stuff here as well, but normally you wouldn't be touching this kind of stuff directly. You would let the library do this for you, unless you wanted to do something really weird. Yeah. So if we go back to main, as you can see, there is not a single call to text input. We've got things like UI init, add font list, add font files, add components, set font update contents, add components, set font update content, give data, add component, etc. Right, and then we've got down here UI begin render, component update states, and then you've just getting the status, whether or not something's been clicked or a value has been changed, and then you end, and that's it. That is it. That is the extent of this program. As you can tell, quite simple. Amazingly simple, right? In a retained mode user interface, it would probably be a bit more boilerplate than this. Like I say, this is still technically retained mode, but you don't have to instantiate objects here, there, and everywhere. That's not the idea. So everything is designed to be built within the global UI state. The global UI state is handled by the library. In theory, you shouldn't be touching it directly. You should use the procedures that NC Star gives you, and then you go from there. Fairly simple, hopefully understandable. I mean, you can touch the state if you wanted to. If I started typing, you've got all of these abilities like the stack. You can go into the stack. You can go into the styles. You can, modify styles if you wanted to. Event states, definitions. You can do all of this stuff if you wanted to. But as I mentioned, the procedures that exist within NC Star is designed to, hopefully catch some errors in case for whatever reason you decided, oh, let's try and do this, and then it doesn't work. And obviously the idea is to catch anything that might occur that you might not necessarily check yourself or forget to check. But that's neither here nor there. It's just a nice convenient feature if you like. But yeah, that's what I would probably recommend if you started picking up this library. As I say, it's still early stages. It hasn't even been released yet. Text input, so we've got that. We've got the UI stack stuff. So like I say, you've got the UI state in it. Adding fonts, as you saw earlier, we used our own fonts from Google, Noto Sans. What was the other thing? So we've got this here, add components. Again, I'll talk about this more in detail later when we actually start developing the editor. And this is where all of the management of the rendering and the event loop happens. So all of the event loop is happening in here, and then finally, I'm doing a lot of for loops here, which may seem a little slow. Again, early stages. A lot of this will probably be refactored and try to speed it up a bit. You know what it's like. I hope. And then we've got down here styles as well. Things like style properties, gradients, colors, shadows, which we haven't implemented yet, corners we haven't implemented yet, property set, all these things that may seem complicated to begin with. Hopefully it makes some sense when we actually start talking about this, the components. Let's talk a bit more in detail about the components. How are things defined? Okay. Go here. Let me comment all this out. And comment this out. We shall build. And then we shall run. So all we've got is a menu button here. And we click it and it prints something out. How does that work? Well, let's go into components and take a look. So you remember when I said about compositions and component definitions? How does it all work? So we've got this procedure here called button def. So the idea hopefully is to put some conventions out there when it comes to this library. So we have a button definition, which is a procedure. We take a font size as the font name and we return a component definition. We've also got this comp name button here, which is a constant string. The reason we do this is purely for convenience, more so than anything else. It also prevents errors in case for whatever reason anyone accidentally types something different than button or mistypes it slightly and suddenly everything goes wrong. Right. So once we've done that, we've got this call to default composition as mentioned. Again, the font size and font name. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying grow bounds to content is equal to true. So as mentioned earlier, we are able to take some content that is going to exist somewhere here, and we're going to use that to determine the final size of this button. Okay. Got a fill, which is, so we're going to call default shape. So we're creating a shape that has some default values. If we type fill dot, no, it's complete not going to help me today. No. Okay, fair enough. Very well. So we've got this fill. So we have a width, which is a distance, measure type percent value 1. Basically what that's saying is we want the width and height of this fill, which is basically a rectangle, not rectangle lines, which is here, rectangle, to be the 100% the width and 100% the height of the bounds. That's the rectangle that we give the component later. 100% the width and height of that value. Okay. We append that to our composition, and then we specify our style binding. What does that mean? When we create a style, which I'll show you later, we are basically saying, right, if we have a background style, make sure that that background style applies to this shape. Okay, that's basically what that means. We'll do the same with border. We'll do the exact same things, but in this case, we're drawing rectangle lines. And we're going to have a border. That's going to be assigned to a border style. We might have a border style. Maybe the rectangle lines are dotted or dashed or whatever, right? Again, that's obviously not implemented yet. Maybe we'll get there. Or maybe I don't know how to do it. I'm sure I'll figure out. We append that. Text, once again, is a default shape. However, this time, what we're doing is we are aligning. So we are saying that this text is aligned And I'm telling the alignment to be V-align middle and in the center. So V-align, which is vertical alignment, in the middle, and then horizontal alignment center. Size is content bound. So again, this is also very important, because if you didn't set this to true, what would happen is let's even take a look here. We say size is content bound here, right? And we go to our calculation. So we've got calculate composition here, right? So we've got all of these content bounds. So we can, if we've got content and the composition requires content, right, which it will, then we're going to measure the size of the string that we're going to be giving it, right? That could be, say, menu, like in this case, and we're going to measure the size of that. Down here, we're going to say the actual width and the actual height is width and height. Now, that's after measuring the text. We don't know the text yet. We don't know what the text is until we give it text. So we need to specify size as content bound, so that when we give the component text, this shape is actually given a size, because as you can see, we omit the width and height in this context. So we say size is content bound, and that means that whatever the content is that we give to the final component is going to be assigned the width and height to this shape. Okay. We then add it. We're going to say that the style binding is going to be for the foreground. We add the composition, and finally we give the type static. Do we have container? I can't remember now. Will you stop that? Yes, we've got container, but it doesn't do anything right now. So we're just keeping it as static. So that's how that works. So what I'm now going to do is show you styles. Oh my. All of this boilerplate. Calm down. This will be improved. So, inside of our definitions, we have a button definition. We are calling that definition. This is where we initialize our components. So if we go back to NC Star and we type in UI init, we call UI init components here. We give it a state, a default font size. I haven't given a default font name yet, mainly because I'm not actually assigning it to anything besides doing it in this context. It actually doesn't make a difference in this context ultimately, in the grand scheme of things. I don't think it does anyway. When we go here, we're not actually, we go into default composition, but I mean, we could do it, I suppose, technically, but I don't think it's going to make a difference. I do it here anyway. But anyway, regardless. So we've got style create, style state. As you can probably tell, I've got this naming convention where if we're referring to styles within NC Star, it's going to start with style underscore. If we're referring to the UI state in some way, it's UI underscore. If we're referring to the components, it's component underscore, etc. Right? That's how it works. So we create a style state, and we're going to call it the name of the state. Because I have nothing to give it. And here we've got state. So we've got an idle, a down, and a hover, which is going to be a new style property set. So we're allocating onto the heap. And in here, we're going to give it some information. So You remember when I mentioned about the style bindings? Well, this is where it applies. So in this case, we've got a border. So we're going to give the border a thickness of 1. We're also going to have a color. Color count is 1. Type is solid. And we're just going to say it's 100, flat 100, basically grayish. And that is going to apply to our border here. You barely see the border anyway. We run it. You can barely see the border, right? What if I decided to change that value? Well, let me show you. Let's say it's 255, 255, and 255, so basically white. Let's build. Take a look at the results. This is just on ISO, so you can barely see it. I mean, you might not necessarily see it. Let me increase the thickness, assuming it works. I should hope so. I should hope so. Build that one again. So there we go. We've got a bit of a thickness there, so as you can see, it does work. Not sure if you can see that or not. I'm literally just going to make it massive. Just make it as obvious as possible. Just to basically demonstrate how this works. There you go. Something ridiculous. And then obviously we hover over it and the border disappears because it's not thick enough in the other forms. But yeah, it's there. It works. That's all that matters. So we've got that. Let's go back to what we had before. Right. And then we've got the same for background, foreground, and we do the same for down as well. So border, background, hover, border, background, foreground, right. And we do the same for everything else that we've ever created, right? Text input as well, when we get to that. So when we actually work on stuff that requires a state, like a checkbox. So let's get rid of this and bring in checkbox. Let's bring in our build, run. So here's our checkbox. We click, checkbox state is true, click again, checkbox state is false. Okay, fairly standard. So what's happening in the background? Well, in order to store that value somewhere, we need to do what's this thing called component data, which takes our ncstar.checkbox. This is the actual data, not the component that you're rendering or drawing or anything. This is just data. Okay. And inside of data here, which is the field of component data, we're passing in an instance of that checkbox structure and giving the default value of checked false. I don't technically need to do this because checked default is technically false anyway, so I could just do this and it will still work, right? I just put it there because it makes it obvious, right? Still works, as you can imagine. And we set the font, we update content, but what we're doing here, we've got this thing called UI give data. And what does that mean? Well, we're taking a reference to this checkbox instance here, okay? So let's say, for example, I did something ridiculous. Like, if I press enter on the keyboard, let's say, what am I doing? So if I do is key released and I do enter, and then I say, well, our checkbox instance not data checked is going to be whatever it isn't. Right, let's just do that. Let's just be ridiculous. If I build this, so we click on it and it does this, right? If I press enter, well, I assumed it would change the value, but it doesn't seem to be doing that. Well, it does kind of work, but it's not visually appearing for some reason. I think it's because well, I know why actually. Technically, when we change it, it's not going to visually change because the way that we do it in here, at least, is we make a certain shape visible based on the checked state of this. So technically, we'd have to do something else. So I'd probably have to do so. Yeah. I mean, the idea eventually would be you would have the ability to say, I want to change this data, and then there will be a visual change to the actual checkbox itself. I don't have that functionality yet. I'll get there. In theory, at least, because I'm doing this when I click is up. Suppose, really, I've got content update request here. Oh no, that's for the text. Never mind. Yeah, never mind. I'll think about it. Eventually, there will come a point when I do something like this, and then there'll be, oh, please update the state of this, something like that, right? The reason I'm doing the is up here is mainly because we don't really want to be iterating through this every single time. We're doing a lot of casting here. So as you can imagine, it would just be really slow if there was a lot of this. So I'm not going to do that. And especially if there's dozens of components on the screen. So yeah, I'll think about it. But that's the general idea. Eventually. But forget that. Forget I even mentioned it. So yeah, that's that. So we've got component data, and then we do the same for inline radio as well. So let's have a look at inline radio. Let's remove that. That in. Comment that out. Comment that back in. We shall build. And we shall run. We have this. So we click. It's changing the value. So in this case, what we've got is a bit more complicated under the hood. So if we go to, it's not combo box, it's this one here. So as you can see, there's a lot more shapes here going on. We've got multi-interactions, which we set to true, as I mentioned before. We've got an inline radio struct, which takes a series of items and a selected index. And we've got some shapes. So we've got, fill, border, text, as mentioned before. But we've also got these things, left block, which we're aligning to the left. And then we've got the left arrow, which is aligned within the block in the center. right here, and the distance is of the width and height is going to be basically the 50% of the size of the block, right? And the direction of the triangle is left. Okay, and then you've got a color variation. This is something we haven't seen before. So this is what's happening here, which is how you saw it rendering here. So we can see the arrows, right? It's plainly obvious. The arrows are there. We can see it. We are still using the same style of the left block, except with color variation. We're basically saying we're going to darken this. So the first value is hue. Well, in this case, it's grayscale, so that's not going to do anything. Next one is saturation. And finally, this one is value. Now, this is percentage based. It's not the specific value itself. So what will happen is when we do the color variation, it will multiply the value 1 or 0.7 against the actual value of the color, and then determine what color to render at that point, right? As you can see, background extra. And we do the same for right block as well. So right block again is aligned. It's aligned to the right this time. And right arrow is once again, we're aligning to, that's the last shape that we added, right here. And we horizontally align to the center and in the middle of that. Same width and height as the left arrow. Triangle direction to the right, of course, and color variation exactly the same. And then we've got this thing here called shape interactions, which is very important. So we've got 3 and 5, which is this probably isn't the best way to do this. This is one of the reasons why I kind of feel like an editor is in order for this library, because doing it manually like this is only error prone, and obviously if you accidentally specify a different index to what it should have been, it can cause, errors. I mean, it's not a massive issue, but it does mean that it's easy to make a mistake in this instance. 3 basically refers to the left block and 5 refers to the right block. And then that changes the relevant values. Now, the one thing I don't do, which is probably what I should do, is actually also make sure that left arrow and right arrows are changed. But I don't do that right now. And then, last but by no means least, we've got text input def. And, we've got a fill. We've got content required is equal to false. So this is generally true. Now, in the case of text input, so this is where things get a little unusual. In the case of text input, even though there is content that exists within a text input field, we're actually telling NC Star that there is no content required. And the reason we do that is because we do not want NC Star to try to measure the size of text based on content, because we're going to handle the content differently. Okay. So the content is going to be handled within the context of a text input. And in this case, that's where we use this field called text input wrapper equal to true, which again is another one of those fields that's important. It's telling us that this text shape when it's drawn, we know what the rectangular bounds is for our text input field. Okay, shape bound text input. Well, this is based on the actual composition. Let's just double check and make sure I'm definitely saying what I'm meant to be saying. So shape bound text input, we use this to determine the calculated rectangle. Yeah, that's important, because obviously we need to get the text input rectangle and give that to the composition when we add component. Sorry, when we add that to the UI state. But next, in the previous thing, text input wrapper here, got this. The reason we have text input wrapper is because we're not drawing anything. Okay, so text input wrapper is designed to say to our draw composition procedure, don't draw anything. We need to also make sure that the draw is definitely text as well, in order to make sure that works. Because draw is a shape, right? So we know what draw. So in this case, we're saying text input wrapper is true, therefore do not draw this shape. Default, right? Ignore it. We're handling that ourselves. Text input is going to be doing that for us, basically. That is the extent of what I've done so far. I am currently going through combo boxes, which involves things like shrinking. There's going to be a drop down menu, scrolling, actual containers and stuff like this. So it's just continually expanding at the moment, and that's how it's going to work. Quite a lot needed to be explained in this context, but more to come. This is literally just the beginning, and there's a lot more to come. So thank you very much for staying on hold effectively for 48 minutes. Thank God it's almost practically the end of the video, but hopefully my explanations of this library as it currently stands is good enough so that you understand what's going on and how we're doing everything. Hopefully it makes some sense. Once again, if you want to take a look at more detailed documentation, you can go to ncstar.io. If you want me to show you that, we can go here, ncstar.io, and you will be given this documentation. Obviously, it's still currently in progress. I haven't added all of this yet. Most of my work at the moment is just getting the actual project to a point where it can be, used by the likes of yourselves. But you've got some information here. We've got a few things here where we're talking about concepts, the basic structure of things and how it all works. So we talk about things like the structure. So besides the basic structure defined above for building interfaces, everything else is left to the user to find how to structure the components themselves. That's what we were talking about here, right? So what I'm basically saying here is you're either letting NC Star do the event management for you, or you're doing it yourself. In my opinion, if you're using this library, then you want to use the library features in order to build user interfaces with. And that includes building custom components. And the reason you want to do that is because if you try to manage events yourself, then your event management code is going to interfere with the event management code of NC Star, and things could get very complicated and very wild very quickly, and things will probably start breaking very as well. So, yeah, just be careful of that and be mindful that if you do go down that route, it's probably going to be a bad idea. But that's basically that for this video. Yeah, I'll try and stick to 2 weeks if I can. Probably won't be possible because obviously I'm working very hard on this. It might be that within the next 2 weeks I have a lot more components and can show you a lot more. Maybe. It just depends on how much time I've got. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.